There were 300 people in that studio, but when that voice rang out, not a single breath could be heard. The cameras were rolling, the lights were blazing, and Paul McCartney's fingers were dancing across the strings of his guitar. Everything was perfect. Everything was going exactly as planned. Until it wasn't. Jimmy Fallon stood at his desk, his signature smile frozen on his face. Paul McCartney, a living legend who had performed on stages around the world for over 6 decades, suddenly went still. His fingers stopped moving. The music died. And in that moment 300 people in Studio 6 beheld their collective breath as something extraordinary unfolded before their eyes. What happened in the next 3 minutes would become one of the most emotional moments in late-night television history. And it all started with a voice that no one expected to hear. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. It was a Tuesday night taping of The Tonight Show. The energy in Studio 6B was electric, as it always was when a musical legend graced the stage. Paul McCartney, former Beatle, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer, and one of the most celebrated musicians in history, was scheduled to perform Let It Be as part of the show's closing segment. Jimmy Fallon had been preparing for this moment all week. His producers had meticulously planned every detail, camera angles, lighting cues, the perfect intro banter. McCartney had done the show before, and every appearance was ratings gold. The audience was packed with fans who had waited months for tickets, some traveling from different states just for a chance to see the legend perform live. Backstage, an hour before showtime, Jimmy walked through his usual pre-show routine. He reviewed his note cards, ran through his monologue jokes with his writers, and checked in with the Roots. Everything was standard procedure. But there was something his producers hadn't told him yet. Something they were keeping quiet until the absolute last moment. In the green room, a woman in her late 70s sat quietly on a couch, clutching a worn leather journal. Her name was Margaret, and she had been invited as a special guest by one of the show's senior producers. The journal she held contained something precious, handwritten lyrics to Let It Be, penned in 1970, given to her by her late husband who had once worked as a sound engineer at Abbey Road Studios. Margaret's husband, Thomas, had passed away 6 months earlier after a long battle with cancer. Before he died, he made her promise one thing. When you hear Let It Be again, remember that I'm still here. In every note. In every word. I'll be there. Tonight, Margaret was in the audience to honor that promise. But what she didn't know, and what no one in the studio could have predicted, was that her presence would create a moment that would change everything. The show began like any other Tuesday night. Jimmy delivered his monologue with his trademark energy, the audience roaring with laughter. Celebrity guests came and went. The Roots performed. Everything moved like a well-oiled machine. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy announced with genuine excitement, performing Let It Be, the one and only Paul McCartney. The audience erupted. McCartney walked onto the stage with that timeless grace, guitar in hand, and took his seat on a stool under a single spotlight. Jimmy stood off to the side, arms crossed, smiling like a kid on Christmas morning. This was what he lived for, these moments of pure artistry and magic. Paul began to play. His fingers moved across the strings with the muscle memory of a lifetime. The opening chords of Let It Be filled the studio, and the audience swayed in collective reverence. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was everything it should have been. But then, something happened that no one in that studio, and no one watching at home, could have ever expected. 3 verses in, just as Paul reached the chorus for the second time, a voice from the audience began to sing along. Not loudly. Not performatively. But with a trembling, heartbreaking sincerity that cut through the air like a blade. It was Margaret. She hadn't planned to sing. She had promised herself she would just listen, just be present, just honor Thomas in silence. But when that chorus began, when those words, Let It Be, echoed through the studio, something inside her broke open. The grief she had been holding in for 6 months poured out in the form of song. Her voice was fragile, wavering, but it carried a weight that no professional performance ever could. It was the sound of a woman remembering her husband. The sound of love surviving loss. Paul McCartney heard it. His fingers hesitated on the guitar. He looked up from his instrument, scanning the audience, trying to locate the source of that voice. And when he found her, sitting in the third row, tears streaming down her face, singing with her eyes closed, he did something he had never done in 60 years of performing. He stopped playing. The guitar went silent. The studio fell into a hush so profound that the hum of the stage lights seemed deafening. Jimmy Fallon's smile faded. His eyes darted from Paul to the audience, confusion flickering across his face. The producers in the control room froze, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the moment breathe. Paul slowly stood up from his stool. He didn't say a word. He just walked to the edge of the stage, still holding his guitar, and looked directly at Margaret. "Ma'am," he said softly, his Liverpool accent breaking the silence. "Would you come up here, please?" The audience gasped. Jimmy's eyes went wide. Margaret opened her eyes, suddenly aware that the music had stopped, that everyone was looking at her. A production assistant appeared at her side, gently guiding her toward the stage. As she climbed the steps, clutching her journal to her chest, Jimmy saw something on her face that he recognized immediately. It wasn't starstruck awe. It wasn't excitement. It was grief. Raw, unfiltered, sacred grief. And in that moment, Jimmy Fallon made a decision that would defy every producer's expectation, every network protocol, every carefully timed segment. He walked over to Margaret and took her hand. "What's your name?" Jimmy asked gently, his voice barely audible over the studio microphones. "Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret," Jimmy repeated, his throat tightening. "Why are you here tonight?" She looked at him, then at Paul, then at the hundreds of faces staring at her from the darkness beyond the lights. Her hands trembled as she opened the leather journal. "My husband," she began, her voice shaking. "Thomas, he worked at Abbey Road in 1970. He was there when Paul recorded this song. He brought me home these lyrics, handwritten, as a gift. He said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard." Paul McCartney's expression softened. He stepped closer. "Thomas passed away 6 months ago," Margaret continued, tears spilling freely now. "Before he died, he made me promise that when I heard this song again, I would remember that he's still here. That love doesn't end. That it just lets it be." The studio was silent. Not the awkward silence of a mistake or a technical difficulty. This was the silence of 300 people holding space for something sacred. Jimmy reached up and loosened his tie, pulling it off completely. It was an unconscious gesture, something he did when the performance was over, when the mask could come down. But in this moment, it meant something more. It meant he was no longer the host. He was just a human being, witnessing something profound. Paul set his guitar down gently, and took Margaret's hands in his. "Thomas had good taste," he said with a warm smile. "And he was right. Love doesn't end. It transforms. It becomes memory. It becomes song." He turned to Jimmy. "May I see the journal?" Margaret handed it to him with trembling hands. Paul opened it carefully, and there, in faded ink, were the lyrics to "Let It Be," in his own handwriting from over 50 years ago. He stared at it for a long moment, his eyes glistening. "I remember this," Paul said quietly. "I remember writing these words. I remember feeling like they were meant for someone. Maybe they were meant for you, Margaret. Maybe they were meant for Thomas." He closed the journal and handed it back to her. Then he picked up his guitar again. "Would you sing with me?" Paul asked. Margaret nodded, unable to speak. Paul began to play again. This time, softer, slower, more intimate. And when the chorus came, Margaret sang. Her voice was still shaky, still fragile, but now it was joined by Paul McCartney's, and then by Jimmy Fallon's, and then by the entire audience rising to their feet. The Roots joined in from the side stage. The cameras captured every tear, every trembling lip, every hand pressed to a heart. It was no longer a performance. It was a collective act of remembering, of honoring, of letting go. When the song ended, there was no applause. Just silence. And then, slowly, the audience began to clap. Not the wild, raucous applause of a great performance, but the gentle, reverent applause of witnesses to something holy. Jimmy walked over to Margaret and embraced her. He didn't care that the cameras were rolling. He didn't care that they were way over their allotted time. He didn't care about anything except this woman and her grief and the beauty of what had just happened. Paul handed Margaret his guitar pick. "For Thomas," he said. She took it, clutching it like a treasure, and whispered, "Thank you. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten." After the show, after the audience had filed out and the lights had dimmed, Jimmy sat in his dressing room, still wearing his suit jacket but no tie. His assistant knocked on the door. "You okay, boss?" Jimmy nodded slowly. "Yeah. I'm okay. I needed a minute." He thought about Margaret. About Thomas. About the power of a song to carry love across the boundary between life and death. He thought about all the nights he'd hosted, all the celebrities he'd interviewed, all the viral moments and trending hashtags. And he realized that none of it mattered as much as what had happened tonight. The next morning, clips of the moment flooded social media. People shared it with captions like, "I can't stop crying," and "This is why music matters," and "Jimmy Fallon is a class act." But for Jimmy, it wasn't about the views or the praise. It was about Margaret. And Thomas. And the reminder that beneath all the lights and cameras and scripted banter, there was something real. Something human. Something worth stopping everything for. From that night on, Jimmy kept a note card in his desk drawer. On it, he had written a single sentence. "The show can wait. The person can't." And whenever he felt the pressure of ratings or network expectations or the relentless pace of nightly television, he would pull out that card and remember the night Paul McCartney stopped playing, the night 300 people held their breath, the night a woman sang for her husband and the whole world listened. But the story didn't end there. 3 weeks after that taping, Jimmy received a letter. It was from Margaret. Inside the envelope was a photograph. Thomas and Margaret on their wedding day in 1968, both young and radiant, standing outside a small church in Liverpool. On the back, Margaret had written, "He would have loved what you did. Thank you for letting me say goodbye." Jimmy pinned that photograph to the corkboard in his office, right next to his Emmy Awards and framed photos with presidents and celebrities. Because to him, that photograph represented something more valuable than any accolade. It represented the moment he remembered why he got into this business in the first place. Not for the laughs, not for the ratings, but for the connection. The human connection that transcends screens and cameras and scripted jokes. Paul McCartney never forgot that night either. In interviews afterwards, when asked about his most memorable performances, he would always mention the night in Studio 6B when a woman sang for her husband. He would talk about how, in all his years of performing, he had never felt the power of music quite like he did in that moment. How it reminded him that songs aren't just entertainment, they're vessels for memory, for love, for the things we can't say out loud. The guitar pick he gave Margaret became a family heirloom. When Margaret passed away 2 years later, peacefully in her sleep, her daughter found it tucked inside that leather journal, next to the handwritten lyrics. At Margaret's funeral, they played "Let It Be," and as the song filled the small chapel, her daughter swore she could hear two voices singing in harmony, her mother's and her father's, finally reunited. The Tonight Show never aired that segment in its original form. The network deemed it too emotional for late-night television, worried it would disrupt the pacing, the comedy, the formula that had worked for decades. But Jimmy fought them. He fought hard. And eventually they compromised. They aired a shortened version, with a disclaimer at the beginning explaining the context. That shortened version garnered over 50 million views online within the first week. People from every corner of the globe watched it, shared it, cried over it. Comments poured in by the thousands, stories of loss, of love, of moments when a song had saved someone's life or helped them say goodbye. The video became a digital memorial, a place where strangers gathered to honor their own grief, their own memories, their own versions of Thomas and Margaret. Because sometimes, the most powerful moments aren't planned. They're surrendered to. They're honored. They're let be. And when they are, they ripple outward in ways we can never predict, touching lives we'll never meet, healing wounds we'll never see. That's the legacy of that Tuesday night. That's the legacy of a voice in the darkness, a guitar that stopped playing, and a host who remembered that beneath all the glamour and spectacle, we're all just human beings trying to hold on to the people we love, even after they're gone.